The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. This is Thomas here from Osnium Software. Today we are doing the administrative and report training for the Oregon database. Before we get started, a few things. If you can see my screen and the mouse moving across the screen, just go ahead and say yes in the question polls or in the question pane as well if you can hear me loud and clear, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Very shortly, we have a few attendees that are still looking to join from the total that we have registered, so we'll give about another minute or two. Then we'll go over with the beginning of the agenda of what we'll be covering today, and then we'll go ahead and get started very shortly. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Just to give everybody an idea of what we're going to be covering in today's training. This training is designed for those of you that will be your agency administrator for the database within your agency. The permissions for yourselves as agency administrators differ than those who are just normal staff or advocates who will be utilizing the database. We'll be covering some of the differences that you as agency administrators have within the database. To go over a few things that we will be covering today is we'll start off with how to create staff. Some of you may have already done this process. We do have it on our documentation website. But for those that are still getting set up with the database, we're going to go ahead and cover it in the training as well. We're going to go over required fields and initial values. We're going to go ahead and cover drop-down lists. So there are certain drop-downs in the database that don't affect any necessary funder-specific reports, which are customizable for agency needs. We will cover some database management of client records. We will cover what happens when we are deleting data. From there, we'll go into our list views or our raw data views, and we will cover a little bit of filtering of how to manage those. From there, near the end of the training, we'll jump into reports, the different types of reports we have in the database. And then we'll go ahead how to filter those reports. We'll get into the funder reports as well. We'll touch upon HUD. And then at the end, we're going to focus on a little bit of program options to do with those who do collect data for HUD, how to set up the database for you to be able to collect from multiple project locations, or if you have multiple shelters that you need to report out to HUD. So that is our agenda for today. Again, we do have the questions pane available for those if you do have any questions throughout the training. I will try to address as much as I can as I see them pop up if it's relevant to the timing of the training. If not, please leave them in the question pane and I will get back to them at the end of the training with appropriate answers for you as well. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start off with how to create staff members within the database. So when you're setting up the database for the first time, you may have initially logged in as the agency administrator account, but now we want to get all of your staff involved to have logins into the database as well. So from here, when I'm logged in currently as the agency administrator initially, I'm going to go to my main menu button on the top left-hand corner. I'm going to go down to Other. Now, those who are agency administrators have access to this subsection in the main menu under the Other category. Some of these options are restricted, for example, staff management for normal data entry staff. So as an agency administrator, I can go over here and hover over my staff list. What that's going to do is it's going to pop up all my staff that I have currently in the database. So this is our testing database, so we have a few training accounts and some arbitrary values for staff accounts here. We're going to go ahead and create a new staff member. So I'm going to go to the top of my ribbon here. I'm going to click on New and go down to Staff. I'm going to pop up a Staff tab. So right now, this is all the information I can collect on a staff member to be created within the database. Few required fields right off the bat are username and then the role that gets assigned to the staff member. Those two things are required when creating an account. For the username, that is up to your agency convention on how you go about selecting what type of format you want for your username. Typical first initial of the first name and full last name can be valid. It's up to the agency to decide on how you want to go about and name the convention for your usernames. Okay, so I'm going to do a test account. So I'm going to say T account. Okay, so this is my test. I'm going to do account. This information here below is optional. Staff paper ID, if you have internal ID numbers, you can go ahead and put those in just for reference. Phone numbers, address, email address, etc. We have font size, so for those that may, the font is very small on the computer, we can't increase the font size. This can range from values between 6 and 24. 0 is the current default font. Okay, once you update the font size, so for example, if I go to font 14, the user will have to log on, log back in for the font to apply. Okay, so once I go ahead and fill out my details here, username is the first thing that needs to be required. Below that, I have to assign a role to the staff. So if I click on add right now, I have a few options here. So agency administrator, just to give a brief idea of what is applicable in all these roles. This is what I'm currently logged in as right now. Agency administrators have ability to delete records. So if they're going through clients, services, if you want to delete stuff from the database, that's part of the agency administrative role, along with managing some of the drop downs that are agency specific. So you can go in and create new values, whereas the staff limited account is limited just for data entry purposes and not necessarily doing any management with your drop down options for those that are agency specific. So that's my staff limited role. Staff read only. This is just a role in the database that is just for viewing purposes. They can't do any modifications. They can't create new records. It's just for viewing purposes. And then we have a volunteer role, which has access to the database that is not necessarily has anything client related. So the volunteer role will have access to provide data entry for the staff activities, whether they're doing outreach, coordinate community response, or just doing data entries for these components. Everything else, people, hotline call, everything else will actually be hidden and not accessible by the volunteer role. Okay, so under the roles, it's an add. I'm going to go ahead and just for the purposes doing a normal staff account, so I'm going to do a staff limited role where they're limited with their permissions. And then to the middle, I have a few options I can select. So by default, there's a few things that are checked off. One of them is active. This is just ultimately to notify in a visual component, and we can manage the list to show just active staff members. Okay. Below that, we have an account locked, volunteer, change password. All these are on our documentation website as well, but I will go over these quickly on what they mean. So account lock is ultimately if someone has access to database but you want to lock their account so they can't log in, that would be checking off the account locked checkbox. Volunteer is a checkbox to give you a visual idea that this account is a volunteer and they may have the volunteer role assigned to them. Change password on first logon. We'll cover that shortly when we get to how to set a password for a staff member. Show in scheduler. So if you recall from the data entry training, there is a schedule component, and on the very right-hand side is a list of staff members. If you want them to appear, that you can click and view their schedule of services they provided throughout the calendar that we have in the database. If that's checked off to true, you can view it. Below that, allow edit own schedule only. This one is used for staff members that if it's checked off, the user will not be able to edit any services or outreach, anything that can be done on the calendar, which is primarily for services that were done by another staff member. So staff member 1 logged into the database and created service records, and I'm staff member 2, and I have allow edit own schedule only checked off. I can only edit my own services that I enter into the database. I can't edit staff members 1's services because I can only edit my own. I can view them, but not edit anyone else's service records. Below that, we have allow remote connections. This is primarily for setup of the database. If we're doing any remote connections, our support team can assist with that and setting that up. Don't save them all and exit and allow bulk add. We don't have to worry about those. Those are done through the implementation phase. So they're not necessarily used throughout the data entry process or using the databases done in the pre-database planning. And then to the very right-hand side, we have a few pieces under the information section. So within the database, as new versions get released, we can push out new versions that will allow the agency to install. So if we have the update permissions, if someone has it set up to none, they won't get any notification that a new version is available. Allow check will just show that a new version is available, so they'll get prompted. Either under the Tools tab, there might be a button that appears at the very end that says Update Available. But allow, check, and install, this might be done for those with agency administrator privileges, that they will only be the ones who will determine if they want to currently at this date install the new version of the software. So allow, check, and install will be those for administrators. Okay, allow, check, and install, this does have privileges also on your actual computer. So even though it says you can install the new version of the software here, you have to have rights on your actual physical computer to be able to install applications. That's something that can be managed through your IT services. Then below we have a few details. So last log off, when the password was set, and then when the account was locked. And then to the very right hand side under Primary Advocate 2, if you remember during the data entry process under a client, you can select a primary advocate. So if I'm logged into the administrator account and I am the primary advocate for staff for clients 1 through 5, I will see clients 1 through 5 in this list here. Okay. So now going back to a little bit of the data entry, I did my username, I put in my first name and last name, I assigned myself a role. I did mention we have to set a password. So right now when I hit the save button, if you look to the very right hand side where my mouse is right here on the ribbon, it says reset password. Currently that is disabled because I haven't saved my staff account yet. It doesn't exist. So what I'm going to do is once I create my staff account, I'm going to go ahead and hit save. When I hit save, now if you notice that reset password button became enabled. So from here, I want to reset the password. So keep in mind right now, change password on first logon is currently unchecked. Okay, but when I reset the password, it's going to put in some arbitrary information here which you can remove. And then, for example, for this convention, I will say ABC123 is the password I'm setting for this user. Once I go ahead and click on reset their password, okay, if you notice the change password on the first logon button became enabled. So what that's going to happen is if I'm setting multiple staff accounts and I want them to each have their own password, I will leave that unchecked. So that I can send a mass email out to let everybody know these are your usernames, your password, or however you want to manage your staff entering for the very first time. When they get to put in their first initial password on logon, so ABC123, they will get prompted to change their password, and they will have to confirm it. So that's what a change password on first logon is. If you want to manage everyone's passwords individually and you want to have control over that, you can uncheck that and then dictate that this is the password you need to use. Okay, so I'll leave that checked off. Once I'm done, I can go ahead and hit save and close. So one of the things that may come up is a staff member forgot their password. So we're just going to do a quick recap how to address the situation. If my test account forgot what their password is, they already logged on with their own password, I can open up their account and following the same process, I'm just going to hit reset password again, give them another temporary password to utilize. Reset the password, make sure change password on first logon is checked, hit save and close. Now they can log on with ABC123 and then they'll be prompted for their password again. Now, if a staff member becomes inactive, so we're going to touch upon something very important here when we're doing and managing our staff accounts in the database. If staff members or you have turnover of staff members, we don't necessarily want to delete their account right away. A reason for that is once we delete their account, when it comes down to reporting purposes, if I delete, for example, my test account I just created, and I want to run a report now on what services did the test account provide last month, even though they're not with the agency anymore, I won't be able to filter out just their services. They will still show up in report totals, but I won't have it as a filter option. So for initial purposes, if a staff member is no longer with you, what you'd want to do is uncheck that is active. That will remove them from the list of staff when you're creating your client accounts. And then just for safe measures, you'd want to lock their account. And maybe you can change their password if anything. But you want to uncheck the is active currently and then lock the account so no one can log in. Okay, so just for this purpose, I'm going to go ahead and hit save and close. Okay, so all of our staff lists, you can do a filter just to see active. So right now I have 36 clients. If you look at the very bottom left-hand corner, there's my is active. If I check that off to true, I'm only showing my current active staff. Okay, but for reporting purposes, I'll be able to filter by the test account if I want to filter on services or anything that they provided prior to them actually not being with the agency anymore. Okay, so we'll keep that in mind when we get into the services to show how that comes into play. So that's the ultimate process for setting up your staff accounts. There is documentation on this on our documentation website, along with if you're setting up any staff accounts that you have any issues, our support team will be happy to help. So once I close out of here, I go back to my person list, and my staff accounts are all created. The next part that we're going to go into is setting up required fields or managing required fields or initial values in the database. So if I open up a client right now, I'm going to go over here and pick Victoria here. If I open up Victoria, by default in the database, we have fields that are currently highlighted with a red halo around them, set by default to be required. These are primarily required because they are used for reporting purposes. So a lot of the reports are driven from these fields. So if they're filled out, your numbers will be very accurate and you won't be missing any information or will have empty values. But for example, if I'm an agency and we require that we need to have a first name or last name at minimum when we're creating a record. As the agency administrator, if I want last name to be required, for example, I can right click on that field. And when I go down to the bottom, I have two options here, set as initial value and make field required. Again, these are the administrative privileges. If I say make field required, I'm going to get a pop-up box. I'm allowed to put in a description. So if it's left empty, what do I want it to say? So I could just, usually for good measures and for practice, I put the field name in quotes. So I can say last name in quotations, space hyphen space, and I can say must not be empty. And then from there, I have the option to say, what type of requirement do I want this? So we have different types of results. So do I want it a hard error? The description is given below. So an error is saying, I have to fill in this field before I can even save the record. So it's a mandatory requirement. If I select warning, that will prompt me that the field is empty, but I can dismiss the notification. So I know it's empty. I'm acknowledging it. I know it's empty, but it's not fully required. And then we have information, which is very subtle. It's not really used that much. It just gives a little icon if you're trying to save and you're staying on the screen. So I'm going to go ahead and say I'm going to make it an error. Click OK. And then there's my last name. Okay, so if I leave this blank right now, and I try to hit save, I am going to get a validation error saying error, and then last name must not be empty, and then it will show where it is. Okay. That being said, if last name is something I don't need required, I put that by accident, I want to clear it, I can right click on the field and go down and say clear required field, so it's not mandated anymore. Okay, vice versa, if I'm doing last name, I say make field required. Just to give a quick example of a warning, I can say last name in quotations and say please enter if known. Okay. I just remember for the make field required everywhere, we usually uncheck this by default in case this field is used in other windows where you don't want to have a required field. So last name is primarily used on the client profile, which is okay, but in other cases, certain dropdowns might be used in other areas. So just to make it on a case-by-case basis, we usually uncheck this field. But if it's a warning, I can say something, please enter if known. So that way, if I try to save the record, it's going to become as a warning, but if you notice at the bottom right-hand corner, I can have an option to ignore. Okay, so I'm ignoring it, and then I'm still saving the record. So if I hit save and close again, because it's still empty, I'm going to say ignore, and then I'm going back to my field of list of people. Okay, so I'll double click on the record here. I'm going to clear the required field. Okay, so that's going over required fields. Now, for example, if I'm creating a client, and then just to maybe speed up some data entry, or if you're constantly putting in the same value, we can set values as initial values. So every time you create a record, it defaults to that value. So for example, I go under services here, I'm creating a new service. Okay, so I'm going to select an arbitrary service type here. And then if I get down to method of contact, if I know primarily 90% of what I'm doing is usually face-to-face, I can click on my option face-to-face, and I can say right-click, and then say set as initial value. So now when I save and close this record, and then I'm saving my client at the end. When I create a new service record, the default value that's going to be put for that field is now face-to-face. Saves me from doing data entry if I know that's constantly the value I'm going to be doing. Just be aware that not to get into a habit. If it does change, it's already filled in, so you need to be conscious that that does get pre-populated initially. Okay, vice versa, if I want to clear, right-click on the field, and then I'm going to go down and say clear initial value. So now the next time I save the record, it won't pop up as defaulting to face-to-face. Okay, so covering creating staff, we covered how to create staff versus inactive and deleting staff and setting up passwords. Some administrative functions with regards to required fields and initial values. Again, we highly recommend the default required fields that are set in the database to utilize them, as they do primarily run on funder report values. So we want to make sure those are getting put in appropriately. However, you want to do other required fields, you can by right-clicking on the field and setting it as required. Okay. From here, we're going to get down to drop-down list management. So there are a few drop-downs. In the Go Live package, there was a PDF stating on which screen you're able to modify values that don't affect necessarily any funder reports, but they're more for agency needs and can vary based on agency. So for example, if I go under program enrollment, this tab and data collection is ultimately for internal tracking for programs to be able to record this information. But if you have multiple programs that your clients can enroll into, if I click on the new button here, I'm going to get my program enrollment. Because I'm an agency administrator, if I go under program, I have children's therapy as an example, counseling program, legal program. Now, very to the bottom right-hand corner, I have a new button there. So if I'm doing my data entry and I'm an agency administrator, first time logging into the database, going through it, getting familiar with it, and I'm realizing I need to add in my programs, I can do that right on the spot based on viewing the drop-down from here. So if I go under program and I want to add in a new program, so I'm going to click on the new button. It's going to pop up a window for my new option. Just for the purpose, I'm going to say new program. And I'm going to hit save and close. So now what I did, I added a new drop-down option to program called new program. And now anyone in the database that will log in will see that new option. If staff limited, in those roles, they do not have this new button capabilities to add in these values. Okay. So from here, I can select new program, I can put in a start date and just hit save and close. So that's how to create new drop-downs. I'm going to cover how to do a little bit of drop-down management, and this is very important when it comes down to how it affects the database. So I showed you from the actual drop-down itself, if I have the new option, I can create a new value on the spot. Another place to do this that was implemented is if I go to my main menu, I go down to other where it says manage staff and drop-down options, hover over the folder drop-downs. These are all the options that I can manage throughout the database for my agency. So I can manage my program drop-downs, my discharge reason for the programs, service location, which can be agency specific, stay location. You have different types of shelters or naming conventions for shelters you want to utilize if you have multiple emergency shelters, hotline services, call referrals, and file attachment types. So just to give an idea of what we're looking at here, I'm going to focus on program enrollment. To show you how stuff gets affected if I'm deleting values or if I'm modifying the spelling of values, I'll show you what happens in the database. If I click on the main menu, just for now for visual purposes, under lists, I'm going to go down to see all my program enrollment records. So I can see from here my discharge reasons of some current records I have are completed program, I have other, I have a few that are empty because nothing was put in. So if I'm managing my discharge reason or my program types, okay, I'll show you how that gets affected. If I go under other, my drop-down list, and let's say I want to change my discharge reason options. So if I want to add in a new one or I want to maybe modify an existing one. So I'm going to go down to discharge reason. Okay, so currently my two options are, I have an option for completed program and other. Okay, if I want to add in a new option, similar to when the drop-down, you have that new button at the bottom right-hand corner, you can still do it through here. I can click on the new button here, say new program type discharge reason. Okay, I'm just going to put, for example, not applicable. Save and close. There's my new option. Okay, so adding new options is pretty straightforward. Now let's say I added other at some point, okay, but I didn't want that as an option. So I don't want people selecting other, and I want to delete that. So looking at my list of options, I have a few records that actually contain the value other. What happens when I delete an option? So I select other, and I'm saying I don't want that moving forward as an option. I'm going to hit delete. Again, I'm getting prompted. I have to check, yes, I am going to delete this, and then saying, yes, I understand I'm deleting this option. If I delete other, and now I go back to my program enrollment, it's still going to stay there. So records that hold a value will always have that value unless changed. Okay. However, if I'm going to go here, open up this record, if I go to my discharge reason, I don't have other as an option anymore. So the moment I change it, I'm going to change it to not applicable, hit save and close. Okay, it's going to be NA. Okay, anything that had that value before I delete it, it's still going to stay there. It's still going to show up in reporting purposes. But the moment I change, I can't go back and say, oh, what actually I want it to be other. So I can't do that. Okay, I can add other in again, which would be one option of bringing that value back. But the implication is once I delete it, I can't select it moving forward, but all previous options that had that selected will still exist in the database and show up in reports. So going back, okay, my program enrollment records. Sorry, I closed out too early on my drop downs. Okay, going back to my discharge reason, let's say I misspelled something. Let's say, for example, completed program was spelled incorrectly, or I just want to say completed. I can open up, double click on that record, and it will allow me to go into the editor here, and I can remove program if I just want to say completed. So I'm going to remove that. What that's going to do is if I hit save and close, if I go back to also see all my program enrollments, once I refresh it, because I'm just changing the spelling, I'm not adding in a new option. Once I hit refresh, all of my completed programs are now going to be updated to say completed. Okay, so that's the implication of modifying a dropdown. Once I modify it, changing the spelling, it will update everybody that has that currently selected. Whereas deleting an option, I'll delete it, I can't select it moving forward, but all old records will still contain that option. Okay, so just to be aware of some of the implications of adding values, deleting values, or modifying values. Okay, so I did mention that we are kind of touching upon deletion, so I can delete values as an administrator once I close out these tabs. If I go ahead and delete a record, so for example, I'm going to delete this new program, I can go under the client. So just to get an idea, there's a delete button at the very top of the ribbon, which I'm just highlighting. That, if I click on that, that will actually delete the client. Okay. If I want to delete a record, if I'm on the program enrollment tab, I have to use the little toolbar under the tab. Okay, so sometimes that comes, I was meant to delete the program enrollment record of new program. It's highlighted, but if I click this delete button at the very top, if you notice what it's saying, it's you are about to delete this adult profile. I don't want to do that. I want to delete this record of program enrollment, so I'm going to use the X in there under the tab itself. So I'm going to click on that, and now as you can see, we're now deleting this program enrollment. I'm going to say yes, delete. Once I delete, I can hit save and close. Now, for example, I deleted that option. I saved and closed the client. I did not mean to delete that. I didn't want to. I deleted the wrong record, or I did it by accident. There is a recycling bin in the database. Okay. If I click on the Tools tab, okay, there's a few administrative functions here that normal data entry staff wouldn't have. So show options, that's more on the administrative side. This model file stuff, which we'll cover later on. Backups, show business object. Some of these buttons are not shown on normal staff limited accounts, but there is under the tools the recycling bin. If you delete something, it does go into the recycling bin. However, the length of the duration that stays in the recycling bin is 15 days from the moment it was deleted. So every 15 days, there's no record in the recycling bin that's older than 15 days. Then it will get completely deleted from the database. The recycling bin to restore a deleted object, if I click on the recycling bin here, it's not necessarily very intuitive to restore deleted options just because of the way the database does it. If something gets deleted, if it's something very important and you delete a lot of records, a lot of service records, our support team can help in going in and recovering that object if possible. We try to restore as much as possible with the database itself. However, if you're dealing a client, and a client was linked to children, and the children had service records, and the child got deleted, depending on how deep you go into the database levels, restoring stuff may or may not fully become restored, but we can restore as much as possible. Okay. So one thing I can do is I can right-click, and then I can go to my Find panel, and then I can search. I'll see if I can find it. Okay, so there I found right here, I searched for program because I was in a program. There's my new program record that I currently deleted right now. Okay, I can select that option, hit restore items. Once I go back here, if I refresh the client, there's that record back. So it is possible to bring back records that have been deleted. It's not very intuitive, but you can look into the Find panel, or our support team will be able to assist. Okay. The reason behind that is for when we're deleting records, we do prompt many times to make sure you know that you are deleting this. You have to check it off and then say, yes, delete this. So there are a few steps to prevent accidental deletions, but nothing, we can't prevent it 100%. So that's the recycling bin. One of the tools that you as administrators or anyone can ultimately utilize if they deleted something, but because administrators have deletion privileges, it's more on the administrative side. So we covered drop-down lists, how to create new options, how to rename certain options if we want to change the spelling or if a typo was made, and how to delete options if we don't want to select them moving forward. Again, with deletion, just a reminder, I deleted that option other. So when it comes down to reporting, if I want to run a report to say how many people discharged or finished a program enrollment where the reason was other, I can't select that as a filter because I removed it. That's the implication we have with deleting. Other will still show up in reports, but I won't be able to filter just for that element. Okay, just to keep that in mind. So once I go ahead and close out of here, I'll go back to my initial starting view. And I'm back to my list of people here. So one other thing that might happen when you're doing your data entry is you might get a duplicate client. Okay, and then how do you deal with someone who entered a client, provided maybe 10 service records, and then I had someone who could create that client the next day, didn't realize that it was the same person. They added maybe service records or stay records or filled up a bunch of their profiles as well. How do I deal with that? We do have an option to merge client records together, so if there was a duplicate. Keep in mind, we do have a duplicate watcher, so if you do create a new client, okay, so I'm going to go just to show you an example. If I do an adult here, and if I put Melanie Lewis, okay, what that happens, because I spelled the first name and the last name exactly the same, it pulls up all clients in the database that match that first name and last name spelling. It might be a person with same first name and last name, which is fine, but you can double check their date of birth, their age, gender, race. There's a few things you can double check to say, well, this is my client. They're already in the system. Sometimes if it's a not and you maybe not realize it, if you click cancel, you might continue doing your data entry. Okay, so we do have a duplicate watcher, but what happens just in case if you do create a duplicate client? So I have two clients here, both with the same last name. One is Melanie Lewis, the other one is just called Mel Lewis. They're in theory the same client, but in the database they're two separate clients. So I can see their ages are the same, maybe a few different options here because this was just an arbitrarily created client. But what you want to do is I want to open up my first one, so Melanie. I'm going to see, okay, well, she has a few of these pieces of information filled in, demographics, some stuff on the general information. She has a program enrollment, a service record, and 2 stay records and a protection order, and a referral. So she has quite a bit of options here. If I go back to my person list, I'm going to click on my second client, who's actually the same, but spelled a little bit differently because it's Mel, so the duplicate watcher didn't catch it. I'm looking here. She has some of the information also, but she only has a 1 service record, 1 victimization record. She had a few hotline calls, but you get to choose which record you want to keep as the master record. Okay, primarily the one that has the most information is the one you want to keep. How the merge tool works. So I'm going to be flipping back and forth between these two clients. I'm going to go ahead and decide to keep Melanie, who's spelled full Melanie instead of just Mel. That's the record I want to keep. This record here under Mel, if you know sexual orientation, primary language she has filled in. If I go down to my full Melanie record, they don't have those options. What's going to happen is it's going to merge this client here. If I select this client to be merged, if a field here, so for example, sexual orientation or primary language, it has filled out here, but it's not filled out here, it'll bring in those values. So it'll merge them together. However, you notice gender here is set to female on the one I want to keep, but the option under this one is transgender female. What's going to happen is it's going to keep the one that already exists. So if it's bring over value and it doesn't exist, it will populate it in. If it already exists, it will keep the one that is on the file. When it comes down to records, so she has one service record, a victimization record. These ones will just get concatenated and added onto the records that already exist under services here. Okay. So I want to keep the client I have. I'm going to refresh what I'm looking at. I'm going to go to the top of my ribbon here, and there's a button called Merge Objects. Okay. I'm going to click on that. It's going to give me a warning. What it's going to say, merging objects results in the object you select from the pop-up list being deleted. Are you sure you want to continue? So what it's saying, I'm merging them together. I'm going to get a pop-up list of clients. I know I'm looking for Mel. So I'm going to look at Mel, hit find. Mel Lewis, that's the one right here. I'm going to click OK. Okay, what's going to happen is it's going to merge all the information over. So as you can see, sexual orientation, primary language got brought over. General information, some of that was missing initially, that got brought over as well. Now, if I look at services, she had one service. Now there's actually two in the list. Okay, so everything else stayed the same. So one service, now it's going to become two. So once I save the client, I merge it. I need to save it to update it. Okay, and then I'm just going to hit refresh. So as you can see, everything came over. I have my two services, two stay records. The previous Mel record had 3 calls. Those were brought over as well. So that's what happens if you have duplicate clients who are actually the same client in person, to merge the records together. Okay, I know it's a lot of information on the steps. We do have documentation as well, but the webinar is also going to be recorded, so you can go back at any time and quickly jump to this point of the webinar to get a recap on how to merge clients. So we covered a lot of the administrative functions that we have on the client level. I do keep mentioning documentation website. If you click on tools in your version of the software, you'll have a button for documentation. This will open up a web browser that leads to a documentation website. Okay. While I'm on this tools function, I'll explain some of the buttons here that we're looking at. Some of them may apply as administrative functions. Some of them you don't have to necessarily worry about. Okay. But what we're looking at here is we have send log file, show log file. This is ultimately just a log file with everything that's done in the database. Application info. At some points, if you're on our support team, they may ask what version you're on. Okay, so then that will show you what version, the name of the server, and everything if we need to at some point get connected. Show options. We'll come back to this at a later date. There's just some functionality you can do there. We'll cover that once we get to a little bit of HUD. Customization, summary, and show business object info. That's more through the implementation phase. We have a database maintenance button. What this happens is as time goes on and you're using the database for years and years and deleting data, we have a section to rebuild and reorganize indexes on the database level. If there's some performance issues that tends to slow down, we can rebuild and reorganize the indexes to speed up the database itself once a lot of data gets in there. Okay, lock model, edit model. This is more on the implementation side, but what happens with the model button, what the model means is ultimately the layout of the database. So the layout is standardized for all agencies under Oregon that are using the software. If at any point a new layout comes out with a new option to collect data, that might be something that everybody needs to get updated. So you're able to, once we send you the file to update your layout, there's a way to import a layout file and then distribute it to all user accounts. So when they log in, they have the new version. Okay, just for version info, at the very top of the header, we have the date of the version that you're currently on or that was last implemented. Backup, there's a way to do backup, set up backups, or support team can help with that to do a backup path. Audit trail, so at any point in time, if something got deleted or something was changed, okay, if I go to my program enrollment, okay, if I look at any type of record under tools, I have an audit trail. If I click on that button, that's going to open up what was done to this record. So I can see on what user, who modified it, when it was created, when it was deleted. So there's a little bit of an audit trail here to see what was done. Okay. And that's for every record within the database has an audit trail. And then the last button here, which is Osnium Connect. If at any point in time, if you're looking for assistance and our support team asks to get connected with you, we do use a screen share application to help out and support within the database. That button will lead you to our website to launch the screen share application so we can go ahead and get connected and resolve any issues or questions you may have in the database. Okay. Perfect. So from here, we covered a lot of client and administrative functionality on the client screen, deletion, drop-down management within the database. What we're going to cover into now is moving and transition into looking at the raw data and starting into running reports and how to filter out pieces of information, how to look for maybe empty or missing things that haven't been filled in. And we're going to get into that side of the database now. So currently, everyone has availability to do this. This isn't just for administrator, but it does tie down into reporting. So if I click on the main menu button, okay, and I go down to lists. Okay, we'll cover reporting shortly. List is going to tie us into reporting. But the list will allow us to see raw data. So all records of services, all program enrollment records I have in the database, so all my shelter clients that are in shelter, all the victimization records, etc., going down through this entire list. Okay, so if I go down to services and I click on this, okay, it's going to show me every single record that I have in the database. Okay, and it has my columns. By default, we put in all the columns you can have on a service record to show up here. So by default, they all show up. You can, if I don't want to see program type or a particular column, I can drag and drop it off the screen. But for the purpose of getting all raw data, by default, we showed all data elements in a column format for each record. So I'm looking at the raw data, great. What can I do with all this? Well, we can do a little bit of filtering on the raw data itself by filtering on the columns. So what I have currently right now is I have the client here in ascending order. Okay, so everyone that starts with last name A, going down B, all the way down to W and Y. Okay, so that's my first filter that's on there actually by default. Okay, I can order it by date. So just by clicking on the column, if you notice, there's a little triangle that shows up whether it's in ascending or descending order. So as you can see, my earliest record is February 1st of 2018. Scrolling all the way down, I have a few records here in the future on November 13th of 2019. Okay, so I can order it ascending. If I click on the column again, it's going to go in descending order, so I can see all the way down to the earliest record being at the bottom and most recent record at the top if I do it by date of service. So that's by clicking on the column itself. If I want to do a little bit of filtering to simplify what I'm looking at, maybe say I just want to look at services I provided under a particular category or service type. If I click on the service type, if I get a little funnel icon, I can click on that. I'm going to get a checkbox list of everything that I have currently in my list as an option. Okay, so if I want to look at just emotional support or safety services that were provided to clients, I can check that off. Okay, so I'll uncheck it just to show you. Currently, I have 79 records. If you look at the bottom left-hand corner, with a summation on my duration saying a total of 73 hours. If I check emotional support or safety services, I will click off. I'm down to 41 records with a sum of total of 33 hours. And if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, you can see the filter that has been applied in red. So the service type was actually set to emotional support or safety services. I can check that to untoggle it but keep the filter, or check it off to activate it again. If I want to completely get rid of it, just hit the X and my filter is completely gone. So that's doing single. If I click on the filter icon, I can do multiple, so I can see emotional support if I just want to see maybe just legal without emotional support. So I have a combination of civil advocacy and civil attorney records. Okay. Now, if I want to do it between a particular time frame, if I do a filter on the date of service, if I want to see just in 2018, I have a mix of 2018 and 2019 here, I can click on the funnel on the date of service. I have a few options here which you can play around with: yesterday, today, tomorrow, some predefined ones. But if I actually click on my drop down here, and I'm going to use the most common one which is actually used is between. So between allows me to select a initial date and an end date, so anything between this particular time frame. So I can hit the beginning, so 1/1, which changes to 2018, and then my end date. So I'm still getting 2019 because I haven't put in an end date. I'm going to say 12/31, and then click on my 2019, type in 2018 on my keypad. Once I click off the screen, that did a little bit of filtering just on my raw data here. Okay, bottom left-hand corner is my actual filter in red saying civil legal advocacy, legal attorney, and the date has to, and the service date has to be between January 1st of 2018 and December 31st of 2018. Okay, so that's showing how to filter by multiple columns, multiple options using a date filter. Primarily between is most commonly used. Okay, so I'm going to close out of here. So I close out my date filter here. Again, I have a count and a summation here. So if you have your footer at the very bottom, if I right click, I can manage what kind of summation or footer I have happening here. So because this is a numerical field, if I right click, I can get a sum, a min, a max, or count, or average. I say average. The average service was 0.92 hours. I can use sum. This is my total. Okay, so if I do a right click, if I clear it by saying none, right click, if I want to get a count of all rows, that's the count button. That does not do a distinct count, it is just a count of all rows. Okay. So one more thing that we can do is, what if I want to find something? So a good tool is actually the find panel. So whenever you have a list view, it could be any list view, whether I'm doing it on my actual list of services, list of program enrollments, any list view. If I don't have a find panel, I can right click on a column and I can go down to where it says show find panel. Okay, that will put up a little find panel here, so I can look for somebody. If I'm looking for someone in specific, if I'm looking for Lee, there's my client, and then we'll pull them up. Okay, so that's that find panel here. So you can type in, as long as it matches anything, it will pull up those records. It doesn't have to start with, it's just if it contains what you're typing in. Okay, so the find panel is a very useful tool when you're searching through any list as well. One last thing that we'll cover on lists is I have all this, two more things, is I have all this data. If I want to organize it in a particular way, what we can do is actually we can group by. So we can group by different types of columns. So if I have all of this information, great, but I want to group it by what services that were provided maybe by staff member. So I can go under my staff member here, which is actually referred to as advocate, as a column heading. If I right click on advocate, I can go down and say group by this column. What that's going to do is actually it's going to take all of that information, all my 79 records, and it's going to group it by my staff member. So then I can expand and say, okay, this is what the administrator has provided on these dates. These are the services, okay, and so on and so forth. So I can expand and collapse these records here, okay. So by calling the plus or the minus sign beside the actual grouping. You can do multiple group levels. So if I want to group it by maybe primary victimization type, I want to group it by service type, I can do further grouping as well. Okay, so if I have all of this, all these services, and I want to also group it by service type, I can say group by this column as well. So now I have a two-level grouping. Okay, so I'm looking at Oregon user 11, everything that you covered under services under emotional support. Here are my clients, civil legal advocacy, etc. If I want, I can go ahead and do that date filter using between to get a subset of all those lists of records into a particular time frame. Okay. There's lots of functionality behind this. So this is just kind of scratching the surface with what we can do in these lists. Okay, if I want to get rid of all of my groupings that I did, right click on the column. This is where all your options are. I want to go and say show group by box. Okay, that just kind of gives me a tree view of what I've been grouping by. I can also just drag and drop to do another level. But if I want to get rid of everything, go back to my raw data form, right click, and I'm going to say clear grouping. Okay, and then I can right click and hide group by box. A lot of capabilities of filtering just within the database using the lists that have been provided. The other option you have is if you're very Excel savvy, you're familiar with Excel, you have a lot of tools, the formulas you can utilize. All of these lists are exportable to Excel. So anytime you have a list, I can just right click anywhere on my grid here, say export to, and I can do a CSV file or an XLS file, and then I can go ahead and open that and manage it that way. Okay, so a lot of different options here that we have. Again, I did show us a couple filterings on different drop downs. One thing is if you're constantly missing values, stuff that has not been filled in. So for example, let's say region of service, when I'm running reports, I'm getting a lot of no data, which I'll show you in a second. How to get to those records, I can do a time frame filter on my date of service. Okay, and then under my region of service, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to the option that says null. Okay, this is going to show me all records that are empty for region of service. So currently looking at the bottom left-hand corner, 43 records are empty. Okay, these are all my empty records. I can double click on it from here. Instead of having to find the client, go into the client, find the service, I can look at my raw service information and say, oh, region of service is empty. So I can go ahead and select this was done in this region. Method of contact was actually required. So I can select that and hit save and close. It won't show up in my list anymore because it's still filtering just for region of service where it's empty. But here I can quickly go in and then select my option, region of service. I can hit save, and I can actually click on, save and close, and then go back to my next one here. Okay, so that's how to manage for when you're running reports and you're seeing stuff that has no data or stuff has been empty or missing. The raw list view format here is the place where you want to go back and quickly see and filter for empty values of a particular data element. Okay. So that covers the list component. Just to give you a quick idea, we have one for each module or each tab. So if you want to see all program enrollment, all clients that are currently all my shelter records in the database. So I have that going on here. Again, I can ultimately do multiple lists at once. Okay, the database is tab-based, so I can quickly tab back and forth between different things that I have open. Okay. So a very powerful tool just to look at the raw data to that component here. So we're coming to the last component of our training is to go over reports. So the list views are great for that raw data and looking through all that information at once. It doesn't really provide us too much on the aggregate side of getting totals, which is where the reports come into play. Okay, so when we're coming and talking about reports, what I can do from here is on my main menu, I'm going to go down to reporting, and then there's two options here that I can select. One of the options is Flex Reports. As you can see over there below, it says module specific reporting. So similar to the list views, we have a list view for all types of all the tabs that are under a client. We also have one report for each client. So for each tab. So we have a services flex report, a stays flex report, a victimization flex report, and they're referred to as flex reports because they're flexible in the type of filtering you can apply on the reports themselves. Below that, we have funder reports. Okay. Funder reports are the ones that have been developed specifically for the funders to go off of the information that's exactly in the database itself. This is why a lot of the values in the database, when I actually have a client open, I can't modify them. So gender, these are our options. Even though I'm an administrator, I don't have the ability to add in new options here because the funder reports, which are your one-click reports, going off of the specific values that have been developed for the database, and they're hard-coded to provide you that ease of reporting for your funders, or for your funder-specific reports for the state. Okay, so that's why some of these options I don't have a new button, because if I add a new value, the reports don't look for that, and then that can skew your numbers. So the database has been designed based off of the funding requirements, and the reports based on the values that are needed. Values and drop-downs, and so example, program enrollment, discharge reason. I have the new button here because it doesn't affect any funder reports. It's more just for internal agency tracking purposes and agency reporting. So I'm going to close out of here. I'm going to go back to my reports, main menu, going down to reporting. And I'm going to click on Flex Reports. And then they're broken down into a few different categories. We ultimately have 3 types of reports. The first one are our display reports. The display reports allow you to take any information that's in the database and then put it into a hard copy or a PDF file, or be able to print out. So if you need to print out an entire client file, or you want to print out the records of the services that a client received, or their shelter records, these are done through the display reports. They're used to display the information that's in the database and then be able to be exported into PDF, Excel, etc. So we have 1 per data type or data entry that you can collect. However, even though they reside here, if I want to print out a service display, if I double click on this, I'm actually going to get an error. And now there's nothing wrong with getting an error here. It's only because it depends on where I get to run these display reports. I can't actually run them from the report to report repository. I have to run it on the actual record I want to print out. So from it says here, error, the report is designed to be run from an individual client service. So I can click OK. So we have 1 for each type of record I can select. Let me go down to my person list here. Okay, I'm going to click on my client here, Melanie. And then I have her entire client file here. If I go down to services, and let's say I just want to print out or get a copy of these services in a paper format, I can either select one, or I can hold Shift or Control and do a multi-select, or Control A to select everything. The ones that I have highlighted, I can right-click. Okay, I can do Show Report, or I can actually go under the toolbar. So again, selecting all of them. Similar to how I said, this is where you create new records and delete them. If I go to Show Report here, I can say Service Display. Okay, so what's going to happen here, just let me skew this a little bit. Scale it down. Okay, so it took those 2 service records and it put it into a printable format. Okay, so there's service record number 1. Everything printed out. There's service record number 2 with a total summary of 2 service records for Melanie. Okay, so I can do the same thing for shelter records. Okay, I can print out 1, or I can print out 2. Show report. I'll do a state display. And then I printed that single individual state record. Okay, the other component I didn't mention, printing out an entire client file. So going back to my main ribbon at the very top, okay, I also have the Show Report button because I'm on my current active client. Click on Show Report. I'm going to get an adult display. So it's going to come up again. So what it did initially was it just printed out their entire file, primary information, demographics, client contact, anything that's ultimately client related. I didn't get their entire file by default yet. This is just their actual information. If I want to get everything that's under their file, service records, victimization records, under the show details, I'm going to change that to say yes. Once I hit submit, it's going to rerun the report. It's going to pull out their demographic and all their information at the very top, but it's going through their entire record and printing out everything that's part of their record, including any children that they have under their file. So if I get here, if I scroll down, I'll make this a little bit bigger. Okay, so there's their client information. Children and dependents get printed out below. There's their victimization record, and then I have their services. So they had 2 referrals, protection orders, everything that was related, okay, gets printed out. So those are our display reports. Okay. From here, I can go File, I could print it, or I can export document, and then I have PDF, Word document, Excel. So I have different options I can export this information to. So I'm going to close it up here. So those are display reports done by each individual tab or on the client file, and run the display report there directly. From there, let me close it on my client. Let me go back to my report repository. That covers our display reports. Below that, we have, similar how we have a display report for every tab or data element that you can collect, we have a flex report for every tab as well, where you can do your filtering. So you can filter by staff members, you can filter by service type, you can filter by victimization type. I'll show how we get into that filtering once we get into the reports component here. So I'm going to focus primarily on services. So I'm going to have my services flex report. I'm going to double click on it over here. It's going to pop up again similar to the display report. And then I'm going to expand my column on the left-hand side, which holds all my parameters. So I just hover by the scroll bar, I'll get my arrows going left and right. I can just drag that over to the right a little bit, just so I can get a better view. Okay. And then I'm going to explain something before we get into actually filtering, is what is designed in the Flex report on the parameter side. So on the parameter side, because I'm running a services report, all the Flex reports are formatted the same way. Again, remember they're module specific. So because I'm running services, I have service parameters, and then every report has client parameters on it. So every report that's on a client will have the module you're running on. So in this case, services. So I can filter by advocates, services, etc., and then I have client parameters below. That's the format for all reports. So I'm going to go from top to bottom here just to give an explanation. The first one here is I have my parameters for date parameters. I have a blackout date, a start date, and an end date. I'll explain what a blackout date, start date, and end date, how they work very shortly. But that's my reporting period here, and then this is a time frame that I can select to see new versus returning or continuing clients. We have generic report parameters, so if I want to filter just by my new or returning clients, residential, non-residential clients, just adults and children, some generic age bands, those are just some specific, generic report parameters. Then we get into the specific report parameters. Because it's a services report, I have my service parameters. Everything that's on a service record, that's a checkbox, drop down, a check all that apply is put in as a parameter. So, and they follow, the order that they follow here is similar to the order that's actually on your data entry, so it keeps that same component. So I can filter by advocates, service type, service, again, those region of service that was on there, co-case managed, those were check boxes. So I have my service parameters I can filter by. Below that, I have a service can be tied to a victimization. So I have victimization parameters below, so I can specify, for example, primary versus secondary. Okay, I can specify by victimization category. Okay, and then if I want to specify by abuses relationship. And then below that, which shows up in every Flex report that has a client on it, is I can filter by any piece of the client data element. So everything is done here from the client profile. It's done in alphabetical order, so it's easy to find. But we have all of my address information, clients alert. I can filter by gender, whether they're homeless or not, by income range, by main victimization, by their primary advocate. All the options that we had on our client profile get shown here to be filters. Okay. So I'm going to take a second here to explain the first part of the reports is when it comes down to blackout date and then the start date and end date. Okay, so give me 1 second here. I'm going to switch my screen here for one moment. So everyone should see not the database anymore, but more of a visual diagram to explain how the blackout date is used. We had a blackout date. We have 3 date fields. So without looking at the actual client A and client B information right now, looking at the green line, that is our time frame here. Our actual reporting period in the blue, in this example, for the purpose of explaining the blackout date, we have June 1st to September 1st. This is my reporting period right here. I'm looking from June 1st, anyone who received a service between June 1st and September 1st. Okay. My blackout date is always the same as my report start date or prior to. Okay, you could think of it almost as the fiscal start date. Okay, so when you're reporting on quarter 1 versus quarter 2 versus quarter 3, the blackout date can be applied to on a monthly basis, quarterly basis. It depends on how you set it. Okay, but what I'm doing is I'm setting my blackout date to back all the way to the beginning of the year of January 1st. So I have a time frame between January and June, which is my blackout period. And I actually have my reporting period between June 1st and September 1st. So if we're going to look at client A, okay, so client A at the top here on the orange, if client A has a visit or a service before my blackout date, okay, so prior to January 1st, so in this case almost prior year, they received a service in that time frame. But they received a service during my reporting period, so they show up in my report numbers. Is this client a new client, or are they returning or a continuing client? And the answer is they're a new client because they received a service within my reporting period, but they didn't receive anything in my, which would be quote unquote my previous reporting period or my previous time frame, which would be January to June. Okay, so client A is considered a new client. If I look at client B, if they received a service between June 1st and September 1st, which is my actual reporting period, so they show up in my report, how do I or the report know that they are returning or a continuing client? And that's going back to check, have they received a service between my blackout date? This could be my previous month, my previous quarter, depending on how far back I set my blackout date. Because they received a service between my blackout time frame or between my fiscal year, depending on how you want to word it or use the blackout date, they have received a service my previous reporting period, for example. They received a service my current reporting period. So client B is a returning or a continuing client. Okay, so that's the purpose of the blackout date. It can be thought of as a fiscal start date, but because it's not limited to fiscal start date, it can be done on a monthly basis, yearly basis, up to you how you want to utilize it. That is what determines new clients versus continuing or returning clients. If my blackout date is exactly my reporting start time frame, all of my clients are going to be new clients. Okay, just a reminder. Because my blackout date is the same as the beginning of my start date, so as if my fiscal date is the same as my quarter 1 start date, in theory, everybody in quarter 1, depending on how you report it, is going to be then a new client. Okay, so hopefully this will be bring a little bit of clarity when we come to running reports and referring to blackout date and then your start and end date. So give me a second. I'm just going to switch my screen back to the database and we'll get into a little bit of filtering. So give me 1 second here. Okay, so now that everyone has that basic information or the introduction to the blackout date, I'm running a services flex report. So for the purpose of the report to show new and continuing returning clients, I'm going to set my specific time frame for 7/1 of 2018. Okay, that's how far back I want to look at my records. My actual reporting period is going to be 10/1 of 2018. And then my end date, or the end of my reporting period, is going to be 12/31/2018, or the end of the year. So without doing any filtering other than applying my date filter, I'm going to hit submit. It's going to run through all my service records, and then it's going to develop the following report. And then I'm going to explain how what we're looking at and the order of what it shows. Now, the order of what we're looking at falls in hand with the order of the parameters. So the parameters and what shows up in the report are ultimately one-to-one with the ordering of the data. So initially, the first thing I see is I have my title, it's a services flex report. I get my time frame, which shows up here, my actual reporting time, so client service records between October 1st and December 31st of 2018. And then below I get a little bit of a grid. This is just for visual purposes to see kind of a little bit of the raw data that shows up in your report. As you're running it for timeframes that have lots of clients with lots of services, this can get quite lengthy, okay, and take up multiple pages, which if for whatever reason, if you're ever printing this out, and it does show client name or identifying or their ID numbers, I can click on the hide the details. What that does is actually going to collapse it, so I don't show any of that information. I'm just showing the header, and then I just get my summaries at the bottom and not showing any of the information, just my aggregate totals. So that's that hide details button. If I want to show details, I can click on that again, and that way I can actually run through it. It is ordered by date, everything that shows up in your Flex reports. So I can see my clients, and then service type by service, duration, and whether it's a residential, non-residential service. So at the very bottom, I have my summaries. So looking at here, I have 11 services, what I provided in that time frame. I provided to 10 unique clients with a total of 8 hours. Okay, so this is my initial grid at the very top. I'm going to scroll down a little bit. The first thing is I get a report details similar to my report parameters. Okay, so right now, oh, sorry, my date is actually 2019 as my blackout date. My apologies, that needs to be 2018. Okay, so over here, now I'm looking at, sorry, my blackout date. I'm not sure, sorry, that changed. It should have been 7/1. Okay, so looking at my information here, so I have all my clients, 10 clients, 11 services. New and returning, so it's actually split right in the middle. I have 5 new clients, 5 returning clients. So again, returning means that they received a service within my actual time frame, okay, and then they received a service between my start date and no more or no later than my blackout date. So I've served them in my previous quarter, my previous time frame. Okay, 5 clients I haven't served in that time frame. My first time I provided them a service within my reporting time frame parameters. Okay, so 5 and 5, I have 10. Based off of those clients, 8 of them are non-residential, 2 of them are residential. What that means is because we have stay records separate from service records, if their service record falls in a time frame while they were in shelter, they are considered a residential client. If it falls while not in shelter, they're a non-residential client. If you receive non-residential services and residential services within your time frame, they're going to get put into the residential category. Okay, and for those that are residential, I have 2 of them. Okay, I have 1 of them is in transitional housing. 9 of them are missing data, which means, well, I have 8 of them that were non-residential, so it doesn't apply to them. But 1 of my clients who is residential is actually the residential type was missing. Breakout of adult and children, this is done by their age at the time of report start date. So I have 8 adults, which is greater than or equal to the age of 18, 2 children, totaling 10. Okay. My age bands, these are just some generic age bands over here. If you have your own age bands that you report out to, at the bottom when we get down to the client demographics, we show all individual ages, so you can, in theory, go through and create your own age bands and get your totals. Okay, so that's all just generic report information. Now we're looking at, I have service parameters, I'm looking at my service information. So because this is a services report under emotional support or safety services, that is my service type or category. So all the categories that show up here, I can see my contacts, clients, and hours. What happens here is contacts is how many times you provided that service. Clients is how many unique clients received that service. And then hours is your total of hours for that specific service under this category or service type. Okay. Right now, they're all pretty much one-to-one. If I run on a bigger time frame, get more data, I will show how that can vary. But your contact is always greater than or equal to your number of clients. Okay. So because in a services report, a service type has their specific services. If I go down below, that gets broken down a little bit more. Okay. So we have 2 columns here of data, service type and service. So under emotional support, if I highlight this, okay, so it breaks it down by anything that falls under emotional support, and then crisis intervention, individual counseling, safety planning. I get specific contacts and clients for those individual services that fall under that specific service type. Okay, so I'll get more information, a little bit more granular there. Now keep in mind, because these are all service information, all of my grand total is totaling up to 11. 10 is my unique client count, 11 is my total services. So because we're looking at all service records of all 10 service records. The cold case managed, co-located, service location, method of contact, and then we get broken down by advocates. So I can see administrator account provided one service by user 10, 4 by myself, etc. So these are all just my normal unique counts or total counts for services by each data element on a service record. Because services can get tied to a victimization, I can see of my clients in the database. Okay, 4 of my clients received services because that were related to domestic violence. 4 of them received services due to sexual assault, 1 due to stalking. 1 of them no data, means they don't have a related victimization that was tied to a service. Okay, and then looking for those no datas, you would go back into your services list, filter out the ones that are null so you can double check which ones are actually missing within that time frame. Okay, so we have related victimization parameters, and then we get down to client details. So similar to the filters below, these are all of my client details. So all of these are going to be totaling a total of 10, which is my unique client count. I didn't mention, so we get a breakout of all individual ages. So that gets shown up over here. I have a broken down by address, city, county, country. All of these are shown up over here, state, zip code. Again, anything that was on the client demographic, we even had a client alert checkbox. We can see out of my 10 clients, 9 of them don't have an alert, 1 of them do. I get a breakout of genders, my homeless drop down, immigrant refugee drop down, all that gets shown here. Again, when we're looking at all this information and we see no data means out of my 10 clients, 4 of them said or yes, 1 was unknown, 3 of them were no, 2 of them are no data, meaning they don't have any values under those. So required fields will help omit the option of no data because you're set to put something in there. But if it's not a required field and you're seeing no data, it's because there was no value put into that particular dropdown. Okay. So from there, income range, limited English, all of them get shown up here in breakouts. Okay. At the bottom, we do have primary race and ethnicities, okay, broken out here. If they are multiracial, we'll show what they disclose as. So if they're Asian and Hispanic and white, so it gives a count for each one. So the report itself shows all your totals. I can go in if I want to look at some filtering. I'll explain how the filtering works here. Again, I have new clients, returning clients. This is not a funder report. This is just internal report on services, which can be used for other types of reporting that you do. But if they're asking for new client demographics, again, I have a combination of new and returning clients. I can go to new returning, say new clients only, hit submit again. And then all of my demographics, if I scroll down to my client data, is just of the new clients. So if you just need demographics on new clients, you can do that filter. Clicking on that, I'll go back to no filtering, saying I don't want to apply any filter to that. I'll go back to my entire total here. So just to get a little bit of a bigger time frame, okay, so if I go back to 1/1 of 2018, I'll set my start date to also be 1/1 of 2018. And I'm going to say my end date is 2019. Just taking a bigger time frame so we can look at more data. Not necessarily worrying about the blackout period. If I click on my hide details, collapse that. 79 services, 42 clients. Okay, so now we can see a little bit more information when I show you my service types. Okay, so under emotional support or safety services, we have 41 contacts under that specific service type to 27 unique clients totaling 33 hours. Okay, so this shows a little bit better of a breakout. Once we have a little bit more data, now we have service types broken down by specific services. And as you can see, crisis intervention was provided 12 times to 9 clients totaling 7 hours. Okay. So if I want to filter out, maybe I just want to see particular services. If I look at my parameters here, under service type, there are my types here. Let me just look at emotional support or safety services. If I click OK, I can do a single select. Okay, so it's saying give me all service records within my time frame that fall under the emotional support or safety service category. I'll hit submit. 41 services, 27 clients. I can do a combination. Okay, I can say service types of emotional support. Maybe I want to see all my legal information. So I can hold control and do a multi-select, and it's saying any one of these. So I'm saying give me all services where it's civil legal advocacy or civil legal attorney or etc. whatever I selected. So it's putting, when I do more than one selection, it's an or clause. So I'm going to hit submit. I'll show details just to show here that I have a combination of all of those options. Okay. So if I did show details, it would expand everything and then show civil legal advocacy, civil legal attorney, etc. Combination of everything. Okay. Now I can do emotional support as a single select. And the moment I do another filter, it is an and clause. So doing a multi-select within one option is an or. If I say and, what I'm saying here is I'm going to hit submit. I'm just looking for emotional support. If I scroll down looking at my advocate, okay, if I go ahead and I'm going to select Oregon user 13, I just want to see their services. Under advocate, I can scroll down. Okay, find Oregon user 13 right over here. Click OK. So now I'm saying get me all services that fall under the emotional support or safety services category or service type, where the advocate I was providing them is Oregon user 13. I'll hit submit, and then I'm down to 3 clients, 6 services. Okay, so there's, if I expand it, that's my filter. So I can do more multiple filtering. If I want to see if I want to see just people who receive service that reside in a particular city, I can go ahead and expand that category and select one or a combination of cities. So I'm saying any one of those cities and hit submit. So the more filters I fill out, the more specific my query gets. Okay. So I can filter out by victim type, victim category. If I just want to see primary victims that were served, click OK. If I want to see primary victims of sexual assault, okay, so that's saying emotional support safety services that were provided by Oregon user 13 who are primary victims of sexual assault. That's my entire query filter on top of my date filter here. Okay. Now if I hit submit, that was very detailed. Oh, I actually get one client coincidentally that falls under that exact category. But that's how granular you can get with your filtering. Okay. Again, all of these reports, if I hide the details, I can export them, or I can print them, I can export them to PDF, I can export them to Excel, and have them in that format as well. Okay. So I'm going to close out of here. Okay, I know we're just near the end of time here. We did start a little bit late to give that buffer. We're going to keep going a little bit more. We have a little bit left to cover in reports before we fully finish off the webinar here. But just to give you an idea, we have reports for each tab. So if I want to look at my stay information or clients who are in shelter, as you can see, once I pull it up, same format, we have our date fields, we have our report parameters. Because it is a stays report, I have my stay parameters right over here, main victimizations of clients, and then I have my client parameters. So it's very consistent across all reports. It might look like there's a lot of data, but it gives you that ability to filter by any one of those data elements, whether it's on a client or a particular module you're running the report on. Okay, so I run it for the same time frame. I'm going to do 7/1/2018, my start date, and 1/2018 to 12/31/2018. What this is doing is getting me all clients who are in shelter between 10/1/2018 and 12/31/2018. Okay, so once I do that, it's a stays report. As you can see, the format is consistent with what we saw before, but it's just on stay information. So I have the admission dates, my clients, how many nights they were in shelter, time they left. Okay, and then I have over here whether they are a head of household or they are a family member, meaning they are linked to a head of household. Okay, we get bed nights broken down by adult and child. Same information here. We have our age bands. We have our stay types. So 7 emergency shelter, 1 in permanent supportive housing, 1 in transitional housing. Someone might have been in shelter into 2 different shelter types within the reporting period, which is why the total is greater than 8. And then we have reasons for exit, destination. So you can do a filter to say of people that show up in the report, how many were went to this destination or the reason for exit. There's a lot of different options you can do here. Okay, same filtering applies. We have our victimization information and client information. Okay, so if you ever want to filter it by particular advocates, you can do that with the services report. Specify just services that particular advocate provided, and then get all their information on what services they provide within the time frame. So one per module, they all work the same way. Again, we do have the in-person training coming up as well. We'll have a lot more time to dive into these a little bit more detail, and a little bit more hands-on, allow for more questions on running different types of queries on the reports. So that covers Flex reports. We covered display reports. We do have the HUD report here. For those that do report up to HUD, you have to make sure you fill out the HMIS information under clients who are in shelter. Okay. In our test database, we don't have too much information on HUD, so even though I do a particular big time frame, won't get a lot, but just to show you what the HUD report does, is you'll need to select your project type. So if I'm running it for emergency shelter, and then we have project name. This is, and I'll show you this near the very end, which we're going to get to shortly, is how to set up if you're running their HUD report on multiple locations. So you have maybe 2 emergency shelters, and they each need to have their own HMIS or HUD report that's run. How do we set that up? So we'll come to that at the very end, which is coming up shortly. And then we have the federal program, so whether I'm running it for COC or ESG. Okay. So if I hit submit, again, I think we only had very little, 1 or 2 records in the database, but I'll show you a few things with the HUD report of how it gets generated. And then there is a button in the HUD report itself that when you need to run or export the report into Sage, there's a button that will go ahead and create all the Excel files in a zip file once you export it to go ahead and get it imported into Sage, for example. So once that's going to go ahead and generate over here, I'll double check if I ran it for the correct time frame to get some information. The HUD report works. It's a special report that's in our database. It does allow for a little bit easier data quality. So if I expand this here, as you can see, once I have this all done, I have all my options here. So number of persons served is 2, number of adults over the age of 18. This report is different than our Flex report. This is specifically for our HUD report here. But when you're getting to the component of data quality, and I'm seeing here that ethnicity, if I'm looking here, I have one that is actually shown as information is missing. And how do I know which person that is? Okay, I can double click on that number. I had a filter there, but then it shows me who that person is that was actually missing. So I can double click and open them up directly from there. So I can double click on the number, and then I have my client here. I can open the project entry from my list, and I can go in and update it to make sure that my information that's missing is set to 0, so my error rate is at 0%. Okay, so this is all done here. This is all specific for a HUD report. Everything is done here as long as you're filling out the HMIS information correctly. Once you're done with it, you can click Run on Sage Export. That will gather all that information, create a zip file with all the Excel files and the data you need already done to submit. So that's the HUD report there. So I know we're covering a lot on reports. We have one more thing to cover, which is almost the bread and butter. If I get down to my reporting repository and I go down to my funder reports, these are our one-click reports. These are the reports that have been worked on and developed for anyone using the database with the exact values that have been provided in the database to be able to get the numbers for your VOCA, for your Muskie, for your FIPSA, for the co-located report, striving to meet the need. All of the fund reports here have been generated with queries behind them that have been hard-coded to get the appropriate numbers. So if I go ahead, if I need to run my quarterly VOCA report, or at the end of the year, I'm going to double click on my VOCA report. Okay. So I'm just going to expand that over here. So these are called our one-click reports, where you just put in your time frame that you're reporting on. The queries are already developed in the backend for each and every individual number, so the numbers get generated at one click. So I'll go ahead and put my start date, end date, and my blackout date. I'll leave it. I was going to go back just to make sure I get data. Okay, so I'm just going to run it for all of 2018. I'm going to hit submit. I'm going to give that a second to generate. And it's going to create the VOC report in pretty much very close to the similar format that the actual VOC report is looking for. We'll give that a second. It does take a little bit of time just to run initially, but once the numbers get generated, they'll be there. So we'll give that a moment to run. So looking over here, I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. So based off of what the VOCA report is asking for, everything is tailored to specifically the VOCA numbers. So even though there might be values of gender values, race or ethnicity values that don't match up with the VOCA report, all of that has been hard-coded for a particular value in the VOCA report. Okay. The mapping documents that have been done that describe the queries that have been used and developed for each component have been provided for agencies as well. So if you're questioning where a number is coming from, you can refer. It is an Excel document that specifies similar in English, in an English format, not a coding format, but an English format of having a service between this and that date with a race or ethnicity or a gender option of this selected. So it gives you the criteria that's used for that specific number. Okay. So it generates the report in a one-click format, so I can see all of my numbers. 34 is my total number of new individuals served. Anonymous contacts is 13. Okay. Because my start date and my blackout date were exactly the same, everyone is considered new in this reporting period, so I have 34. So I get all of my race, ethnicity, gender, and age breakouts accordingly. If I go down to the very bottom here, there's number 6. Everyone for types of victimizations. So I get my counts across to the right. B, people present with more than one. I had 7 clients that presented with more than one. I get a breakout into my special classifications. And I get down to the very bottom, which we get down into direct services. Okay, so we have them broken down by category, where the first number is the number of individuals. So in this case, I have 2 individuals that fall under category A, and then the following counts for each subcategory. So I had 11 individuals in the following counts. Okay, so over here, so emotional support, 26 number of individuals received any one of those services between C1 and C7, with my count of contacts for crisis intervention, hotline, etc. So all of these have been developed in the backend to get these reports generated. When you're running your reports or you're submitting your reports, you can translate this document into the actual document you need to submit. There is going to be a training on the coalition side of things when they're looking across, getting numbers across all agencies, which they will ask you to export this report into an Excel file that will need to be submitted to the coalition. So once this report has been generated for the time frame, you can click on the Export to Excel button, and that will put that into an Excel file formatted the same way that you can submit to the coalition. Okay. So all of that is done within the one-click reports. So we have it done for VOCA. If I have, for example, the Muskie report, same idea, just to give you a quick glimpse on that. I'll keep the same time frame. I'm going to go ahead and hit submit. It will generate the same way that we saw the VOC report. So I noticed as I'm going through the reporting component, and this was expected, I am getting quite a few questions in the questions pane. I will get a chance later on to go and review your questions and provide answers that I can for the questions, and then submit that for everyone to be able to see once I give it back to the project coordinator. Okay, so for the Muskie report, same idea here, all the questions 25 regarding victim services. So A and B and C. Okay, just to give an idea, once you have your database up and running and you have your data, you can start running these reports to get an idea of your numbers, and just to make sure everything is being counted accordingly. Okay. So there's one for each of these options here. Each of these are hard-coded with the queries behind, which is why it's very important that those required fields that we had set at the beginning, they were highly recommended to keep as required fields so that your numbers get put in appropriately and not into a catch-all number if it's left empty or under the unknown category. Okay, so then I did mention there was one more thing I wanted to cover, which is setting up project locations for those that have report up to HUD and have more than one emergency shelter. So clicking on my Tools tab, if I go under Show Options, okay, you could go ahead and these are some of the options you have based off of your agency, so you can go ahead and put in your shelter name. Max stays, this is the number of, for example, if you know you have 10, 15, 20, 30 beds available, you can set up the number maximum of beds you can have utilized. So that way, if someone comes into shelter in your database, if I have, for example, 50 beds and they're coming in, I put in a record that's 51, it will give me a notification saying that I'm over capacity ultimately, just to give you a warning with regards to the data that you're putting into the database. Okay. So there's a few options here. But we're going to go down to the project location. So over here, if I have multiple emergency shelters, I have one right now. So P01 is the ID number, emergency shelter. Just if you have one, you can leave it as is, but it says default emergency shelter location. If I have another emergency shelter location, I can create new. I can put in my name. So I'm going to say ES2, emergency shelter number 2. Project ID, you can follow the same format. So I can do a P01A, you can do a P13. It's up to you how you want to do that. It's up for your discretion. And I'm just specifying this is an emergency shelter. So once I hit save and close, now I have multiple emergency shelters at my default and then my emergency shelter number 2. So when I'm filling out my HMIS information, I can select when I select emergency shelter, whether it is information for emergency shelter 2 or my default emergency shelter location. Okay. So there's a few options here. Once I get down to security options, if you're looking to set up the database and get some remote authentication done, depending on how your agency gets set up, our support team will assist in setting up here to auto-create your users and logins. Okay, there's a section for password complexity. So there's a few options here. Again, there's so much information in the database. We're trying to cover as much as we can this admin report training. We will have the in-person training where we'll have ability to get into this detail, to get this information a lot more in detail and a lot more hands-on and have a little bit more of an interactive conversation as we're learning and experiencing and finding out new features within the database for our data entry collection. So on that note, that covers everything with regards to the administrative training, administrative functions, setting up your staff accounts, working with your drop-downs, setting up required fields, reviewing the recycling bin, merging clients, reviewing all the lists for your raw data entry and how to manage those, the different types of reports. Don't forget the flex reports. We have that blackout date that's used for new and continuing clients, the different types of reporting we have, the HUD report, and then anything else covered. I will look through the question pane and see if I can address those as well. We are looking to get these recordings out very shortly now that we have both of them completed, so they'll be released together very shortly for everyone to view. And if you ever need to recap or have any other staff trained, they'll be available for your viewing. Other than that, I want to thank everybody for attending the training and attending the webinar. Have a great, wonderful day. And if anything, I will be seeing you in person near the end of March. So thank you everybody for your time and have a great day.